Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining and listening in. Welcome to the Commonwealth Learning Partnership's Policy and Advocacy Conversation Series designed to help Virginia educators and on-the-ground practitioners better understand and navigate education policy across Virginia and within individual policy contexts. My name is Erica Cuevas. I'm a Senior Policy Manager at Jobs for the Future. JFF is a national nonprofit organization that seeks to drive change across our nation's education and workforce systems. JFF is a strong partner and supporter of the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. At JFF, we believe strongly that educators and on-the-ground practitioners play an important role in serving and helping design and inform equitable and practice-informed policies in their regional areas. But far too often, we know that educators and on-the-ground practitioners are often missing from those critical policy conversations. So that's why we're bringing to you this series of conversations focused on policy and advocacy. Today's conversation will focus on policy and advocacy from the executive branch and state agency perspective. And with that, I will pass it over to our friends and colleagues at Capital Results who will help lead and guide the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm Julie Radio, and I'm with Capital Results, and I'm just going to introduce the panelists and serve as a light touch monitor or moderator to keep the conversation going. And I want to just do a quick introduction. The star of today's show will be Holly Coy, who she is currently serving as Assistant Superintendent for Policy, Equity, and Communications at the Department of Education in Virginia. And she has a long resume that led her to this point, which I'll let her explain more of. And Gina Keller, who is the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Learning Partnership, but also has worked in education in Virginia for her entire career, and her last position before leaving was as an Assistant Superintendent at the Department of Education as well. And then Rob Shin, who's a partner of mine here at Capital Results, has done a lot of lobbying on education policy at all levels, higher ed, K-12, and early childhood. And so we just asked him to participate in the conversation to give the perspective of someone coming to policymakers within Virginia. As Erica said, there's a series of these webinars that we're putting up to help people understand the environment they're working in when they come to meet with policymakers. There was one on the legislative branch, and this will really focus on the executive branch and their role in education policymaking, which is quite complex. So let me just start with Gina, if you just give a little bit of introduction of yourself, and then Rob, if you could follow her, and then Holly, we'll have you introduce yourself and just start giving us your advice, and then we'll guide the conversation from there.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm been in public education for 40 plus years and have worked in lots of roles and opportunities, from teaching to administration, and then superintendent, and then at the Virginia Department of Education was there as the Assistant Superintendent for Learning. I retired in September 2019 for approximately 1 week, and took on a responsibility of the Executive Director for the Commonwealth Learning Partnership. And just thank you so much. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Rob Shin, a partner with Capital Results. I started out actually in state government back in the Wilder administration and have been, over the last 30 years, doing advocacy from the private sector perspective, although some of our clients include Virginia Community College Foundation and Southern Virginia Higher Education Center. So we engage with some public entities and private entities as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Coy, currently serving as the Assistant Superintendent for Policy, Equity, and Communications at the Department of Education. But my career in state government started working for an advocacy nonprofit organization. And since then, I have held a few different roles within the executive branch, including for then Lieutenant Governor Northam. And in the Secretary of Education's office, I was a K-12 deputy under both Governor Northam and Governor McAuliffe, and served with a few different secretaries in that role. And I'm delighted to be joining you all today and engaging in this conversation about how to embark in state advocacy work.
Holly, why don't you start by talking a little bit just about the structure of policy making on the executive branch side. There's a lot of different entities from the governor's office and the agencies that are involved, and maybe you can just start by talking about how that all bubbles up.
Sure. So in state government, I think there are now more than 100 different state agencies, and all of them report kind of up to a secretary. And there are a number of secretaries that report up to the governor. And so it's kind of a tiered structure whereby secretaries work with numerous related agencies on a particular content area and advise the governor on matters related and within the jurisdiction of those agencies. So for the Secretary of Education, the purview is broad. It includes working relationships with our institutions of higher education, community colleges, the Department of Education, and all of the local K-12 divisions throughout the state, as well as some work around early childhood and preparing students to be ready to learn when they get to kindergarten. It also, interestingly, in the Education Secretariat, includes museums and cultural institutions like Jamestown, Yorktown, or the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. So it's a broad swath, but the Secretary's role there is to advise the governor on how those different agencies and entities are working together, foster those relationships, and advance the governor's agenda for work in the Commonwealth and improving services to citizens.
That's a great basic understanding of it. And Rob, maybe you can jump in and just talk about how, working on an advocacy basis for the various education interests that you represent, how you engage during that process.
Sure. So on any given issue, you're going to be lobbying with the legislative branch, but a lot of the policy work really has to start at the executive branch level. So typically, we will start talking at the agency level with the practitioners in the policy area, but then everything flows upward in a governor's office. So, for example, if we're working on something for the community colleges, we know that eventually it'll get to the Secretary of Education, policy director, and then all the way up to the governor. So I think an effective way to think about advocacy in this space is to start with the people at the agency level often, but then realize you need to go to the governor's office and the secretary's office, and then, oftentimes the governor himself to get him involved. So it really depends on the individual issue. But, when I'm thinking about these issues, if you haven't won over the people at the agency level, it's very difficult to kind of go above them to the secretary, or the governor. You can do that, but it's just often harder. So my philosophy on most issues involving state government is that if you can win over the people closest to the issue, you've got a good chance of then convincing the governor's office and getting the executive branch on board.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Gina, you bring a perspective of someone who has worked in the field in education and then become part of the policy making. So let's have your experience in terms of being on the receiving end of educators who really want to have some influence in policy when you were at DOE.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting position to be in when I moved into the role of Assistant Superintendent for Learning at the Department of Education. And interesting in that an opportunity for me to recognize as a practitioner in the field for 35, 36, 37 years, how the processes really were alive and well, and the protocols for policy decisions became so real to me. And as I'll use my experience as not only a teacher, but a superintendent, where even in that space as a practitioner, the superintendents as a collective have a very nicely formed organization that looks at policies and works to advocate for things that ultimately impact the lives of children and families in their communities. While I was at the Department of Ed and taking those experiences to the Department of Ed, I recognized, and I say this respectfully, that I started to understand why things took so long, and that things couldn't, not that I expected as a practitioner in the field that things at a snap of the finger would change, but I understood intricately how important it was to speak in a way, whether it was before the Board of Education or to the agency, bringing information and requests and advocacy statements to the agency, really required all of us to not only know the processes at the state level, but to know the processes and the timelines as a practitioner. But always, and not to oversimplify it, but always how important it was to understand the implications of a particular issue. And I learned so much at the Department of Ed, but really what resonated was, and I used this as my outreach to superintendents and teachers, what resonated for me was to help them understand how important it was for them to be knowledgeable about the implications of a particular policy on their life, the community, the lives of those in their communities, and then how to speak in a way that didn't distract from what they wanted to have happen. And that was the case whether I sat in a Board of Education meeting, or if I was even the one person that many reached out to because they knew me. And I had deep connections with, and continue to, with educators across Virginia. So in a nutshell, again, understanding deeply the processes, and I learned so much being there, but also how important it was to understand the issues in a way of the implications for your community, because therein would give great opportunity for people to listen to you when it wasn't tethered with a great deal of emotion, but was actually grounded with a great deal of understanding of implications.
Yeah. Well, that leads right into what I think is the next major discussion point for us, and probably the meat of this webinar, and that is what advice do you have for an individual who wants to engage in the policy process as far as the best way to be an effective communicator on this? Holly, do you mind taking that on?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share some thoughts on that. So first and foremost, I would just say to anybody who's kind of embarking on this, maybe for the first time or re-engaging in this after some time off, it can feel intimidating from the outside, but behind the processes are real human beings, whether they're legislators or in the executive branch or in the agency, who are committed to their public service. And while there may be disagreements about the nuance of any number of policy issues, there really is a genuine shared commitment to bettering the lives of Virginians. And so I think starting from that place and recognizing that there may be some conversation about different tactics, but that ultimately, especially in education, that there are many shared goals there. And starting from that place can be really helpful in your advocacy. And second, as part of that, knowing that policymakers want to hear from you. As Gina said, they need and they want to know how existing or proposed policies impact your daily life, impact your students, impact your schools and your broader communities. They want to know what the unintended consequences are and whether or not you perceive those policies to actually be achieving what they were designed to do. And so I think it's important to know that feedback is welcome. There are lots of ways to do that, whether it's in public hearings or through written advocacy or through kind of more informal communications with former colleagues like Gina that can advance those conversations. as someone who doesn't come from the practice of teaching, I spend a lot of time listening to colleagues, to practitioners, to education leaders in the field, because I can tell you all about the different levers to pull and how to pull them and which order to recommend you push and pull in from a state policy making perspective. But I need to hear and be grounded in the reality of what those policies are on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really appreciative of the many folks along the way who have helped me stay grounded and who remind me of the practical implications of some of the state policies we work on.
That's great advice. And I think we've all experienced that people do, even if they are vehemently opposed to each other's approach to something, there is a common thread there that you really need to build off of. And I think Rob maybe can give us some very practical advice. I mean, obviously policymakers want to hear from people, but Rob, if you can get down into the details of there's a good way and a better way. I don't want to say there's ever a wrong way, but there's always better, more effective ways. And maybe you can be very matter of fact about that.
Yeah, so my approach when it comes to advocacy, whether it be at the executive branch or legislative branch, number one, keep it very simple. I think the mistake a lot of people make is they come in and they try to say way too much. Executive branch leaders have a lot on their plate. So when you go in and visit with Holly, or you might have 5 minutes, you might have 10 minutes. But you need to be very focused in what you say. Bring a one-pager to keep it simple. If it's a more complex issue, you can always, email the official other documents that they might need that might help them if they want to get down in the weeds. But one, keep it simple. Number two, be very authentic. The last thing you want to do is come off like you're reading, some prepackaged set of message points, and to that extent, like personalizing messages. So if you're talking about, as a teacher, something that's going on in your area, maybe you're talking about whether schools should reopen, tell the official what that means from your perspective. The fear you're feeling, teaching and not wanting to get coronavirus, for example. So, I think those are the two most important things: be authentic, be simple, and bring documents like one-pagers that you can leave with the official, because they may have 20 meetings in a day and they're not going to remember everything you said. So, but erring on the side of simplicity is the biggest thing.
Yeah, Gina, you've been on both sides of that conversation, from the outside, trying to influence in, and also being on the inside and getting those messages. Maybe you've got some examples of some highly effective things, or just some general advice about what is effective in communicating.
Mm-hmm. Truly, what Rob and Holly have said, resonates with me as I think about my experiences in advocating up, to agencies or to legislators or across with other superintendents. But keeping it simple is really important. And at the same time, I understand how that may not make a lot of sense to people who are very emotional about a particular issue. And I think about things in particular related to, I'll give an example, related to educating a special needs child. We happen to have a special needs child who had a beautiful educational experience. But what I found in those who would either come to me to speak about a particular issue as a superintendent, but really especially as an assistant superintendent for learning, they would often these particular people would often get into almost a tailspin of emotion, because the things that they were concerned about had implications for their child, but often there wasn't a depth of understanding about how it could be beneficial for their child. And so my point is this: when you're advocating, do a lot of homework and don't do it alone. You may step in a space where you're speaking as a single person, as a sole person for that particular issue. And if you know you have 10 minutes or 15 minutes with someone, or a very short time before the Board of Education as an example, or with a particular legislator, reach out enough to gather as much information as you can, and then be able to define better what those implications are for your child. Because Holly's right, and I have found that to be so true, is that legislators want to know what the implications are. But what they want to know are the implications from a person who's done a lot of homework and can speak in a way that says, I understand this and I understand implications for many, many families, but let's talk about mine. It gives you a degree of credibility, and I would even say grace, as you advocate for the things that you want to have happen. Then you're able to say, I've talked to so-and-so and this person and these people and this particular person who helped me understand this particular policy and why it matters for many, but let's still talk about the implications for me. That would be my advice.
Yeah, and let's just talk a little bit to someone who's maybe never engaged in any kind of policy making. There are a lot of points of entry in terms of, the local level, the state level, the executive branch level, the board level. But talk a little bit about, Holly, just if you're, imagine yourself as someone who's never engaged in policy, and maybe tell us, maybe where would you get started if you wanted to start looking into an issue you felt passionate about, to try to start to understand it and get engaged in it?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I would offer up for consideration is recommending that folks find ways to connect with an advocacy organization related to your interests. This is a way that you can stay apprised of current issues, those key opportunities and moments to engage with policymakers throughout the process. Many advocacy organizations facilitate kind of citizen lobbying trainings or lobby days. They can provide some of that broader context that Gina was speaking to about the issue and how it impacts a number of different constituencies, perhaps including your own constituencies or your own family or your own community. And that broader perspective can help you be more effective in the advocacy in the long run. There are other entities and organizations that work at the local policymaking level, working with local boards and entities. They are great oftentimes at simplifying the message, as Rob spoke to, and helping navigate the process. So that you don't have to become an expert in the regulatory process in Virginia, but that you can rely on other experts to let you know when the key vote is, when the key opportunity is, some of the nuance behind the policy and how it's evolved and why, and what that means for refining your own advocacy efforts. And so I think that community, that expertise is a great way to embark in this process broadly.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it was Gina that touched on how when she first came to the executive branch, realizing how long these processes are, but sometimes with good reason, to make sure that policy comes out the right way. So Gina, talk a little bit about following if you were, pretend you're new to this process and following a piece of policy through the process, and how someone might do that.
The first bit of advice I would give is be connected with someone at that agency. So we'll talk about the Department of Education. I would, and Holly will love this because I would advise them to go to Holly. So
Thanks, Gina.
I would say, yes. Holly has lots of great experiences. Holly also has an amazing ability to listen, and that's not said in some cliche way. Holly does a really good job of listening. So seeking someone out at the agency so that you are able to pick up the phone or the email or send an email that says, I'm really interested in this particular issue or this particular proposed policy, whether it's the standards of quality or standards of accreditation or whatever it is. Could you direct me to the right person so I could learn more? That's the first thing. The other thing is just asking for, sometimes I know people don't know what they don't know, but asking for information in a way that gets what you need. So being able to send that email or make that phone call and be able to say, I really don't know what I don't know about the processes and how long it takes. And I have teachers actually contact me quite often and ask about the process of the review of the standards. So the standards of learning that get reviewed, and there's pretty much a 7-year cycle, but there is a place or there is the opportunity, I should say, that when needed, the standards can be reviewed more often than 7 years. And we saw that happening and see that happening now with our history and social science standards. So again, the point is to be able to reach out. Holly said it beautifully when she said, you don't have to necessarily know every intricate step and detail and how something gets pushed through to finally become policy. But what it behooves us to do as citizens is to seek out information that helps guide our input and the degree of information that we have, because probably almost 100% of us can speak with some degree of knowledge about how it possibly could impact us in our lives. But many of us, and as I took calls at the Department of Ed, and actually then when we were able to have face-to-face time meetings, was able to sit and talk with someone, what I understood often was that they just didn't understand why it took so long. And I grew to understand that a lot better. And Julie, as you were saying, that's a safety net as well, because it gives us opportunity to find out more, to seek stakeholders' input. But again, long story short, reaching out, being willing to do that, being willing to seek some advice, asking people who is the go-to person so I better understand this process, and doing your homework.
Yeah, and we're down to the last few minutes, but Rob, I think Gina touched on something that maybe you can throw out some good online resources that you as a professional lobbyist use to track the timing of the process so that people can time their advocacy appropriate to when the policy is being made.
Yeah, and let me just touch on a couple things that Gina and Holly said that I think wanted to flesh out in a little more detail. Is when you're lobbying in the legislative context, you know, you're going into somebody's office, you're often going in as the constituent. And so just saying you're for or against something is going to be very meaningful to that legislator. But advocating